Welcome to a journey deep into one of the most unsettling mysteries in Appalachian history. Today, we'll uncover the chilling events that rattled an entire mountain community in North Carolina during the height of World War I. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Let's descend together into this shadowed story. It was the fall of 1916. North Carolina was tense, a state standing at the edge of a world at war. While the coastal towns buzzed with news from Europe, carried by telegraph, time seemed to stand still in the Appalachian Mountains. Among those mist-wrapped peaks and narrow valleys, life moved at its own rhythm. Entire communities lived cut off from modern society, connected only by rugged trails twisting through dense oak and pine forests. Madison County, in the state's far west, was one such isolated pocket. Small farms clung to steep hillsides separated by miles of wilderness. The nearest civilized town was nearly 2 days away by horseback. Winters were merciless, with blizzards that sealed families inside their homes for weeks at a time. And it was within this harsh and forgotten land that the story of Silas Ward began. Silas was a recluse, known to most only by name. Around 45, he had built his cabin high on a lonely ridge, far from anyone else. Smoke rising from his chimney was a rare sight. He shunned the small Baptist churches scattered across the county and seldom appeared at the general store in Marshall, the county seat. When he did, he purchased basic supplies, spoke little, and vanished back into the woods. No one truly knew where Silas had come from or why he'd chosen such a remote life. The oldest locals recalled that he'd arrived around 1908, maybe from Tennessee, maybe Virginia, but no one was certain. He paid only in cash, never owed a cent, and stayed out of the feuds that occasionally flared among families in the hills. Still, there was something about his presence, his piercing, almost translucent eyes, his quiet, gravelly voice, that unsettled even the bravest men. For years, Silas Ward was little more than a ghost on the edges of local gossip. But by the summer of 1915, whispers began to spread. Families living within a few miles of his ridge started reporting strange sights. Flashes of light deep in the woods at night, always coming from the direction of Ward's cabin. These weren't ordinary lantern glows, they pulsed and shimmered, lasting for hours. One farmer, John Mercer, who owned land down in the valley, was among the first to speak of something darker. In early September 1915, he and his oldest son were checking traps near the ridge when they heard noises. Something between a low moan and a chant. It wasn't singing exactly, but it carried a strange rhythm, like a sound not meant for human ears. The two were overcome by an eerie sense of dread and left immediately. When John later mentioned it at the warehouse in Marshall, several men admitted to hearing similar noises. Yet none dared go near Ward's land. In these mountains, people lived by an unspoken rule: never trespass on another man's property, no matter what. Besides, the region was struggling. The economy was collapsing. Young men were leaving for mill jobs in the east, and no one wanted to stir up more trouble. The winter of 1915-1916 struck with brutal force. Snow came early in November and lingered until March, cutting families off from one another. Weeks passed without word from neighbors. When spring finally melted the roads clear, people began noticing something deeply wrong. Someone was missing. Her name was Sarah Holt, a 17-year-old girl, the eldest daughter of Thomas and Martha Holt. In early April 1916, she left home at dawn to fetch water from the nearby creek. It was a short walk. She knew every step of the path. But Sarah never returned. By sunset, when she still hadn't come home, her father gathered neighbors and launched a search that stretched 3 long days. Nothing was found. Not the bucket, not a footprint, not a single clue. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The disappearance shattered the close-knit valley. Search parties combed the forests, explored caves, and traced the creek for miles. Thomas was broken, Martha barely spoke. Friends brought food and offered prayers, but no comfort could mend the hole left by Sarah's absence. When word reached Madison County Sheriff Robert Clay, he took the matter personally. A seasoned man in his 50s who knew the mountains like the back of his hand, Clay led a formal investigation, but quickly found himself baffled. There were no leads, no evidence, and no reason. Yet one name surfaced repeatedly in conversations: Silas Ward. Not because anyone had seen him near where Sarah disappeared, but simply because he was the stranger, the one no one truly knew. Sheriff Clay decided to make the climb to Ward's cabin. It was a punishing trail, steep and tangled, nearly impassable in places. He brought along 2 deputies, strong men accustomed to the rough terrain. When they finally reached the ridge, they found Silas tending to a small garden behind his cabin. He greeted them with a polite, distant calm. His home was plain but orderly, firewood neatly stacked, a few chickens pecking in the yard, everything almost unnervingly tidy. Clay explained why he'd come, to ask if Ward had seen or heard anything unusual in the past few weeks, in 1912, leaving no relatives who could provide additional details. There were no prior deeds under Ward's name in the state, no tax records, and no indication of where he had lived before that purchase. It was as though Silas Ward had materialized out of nowhere in 1908, bought the land, and quietly disappeared into the mountains. When Webb questioned long-time residents, their recollections were vague and fragmented. A few remembered the day Silas arrived, a tall, pale man leading a mule and carrying little more than a small trunk. He built his cabin alone and rarely spoke to anyone. To some he seemed harmless. To others, there was something unnerving about the way he kept to himself, especially his habit of walking the woods late at night with a lantern, even in the dead of winter. As Webb pieced through the accounts, he began noticing how often strange lights had been mentioned. Flickering, rhythmic flashes coming from the ridge long before the disappearances ever began. He started to suspect that these stories, once dismissed as mountain superstition, might be more relevant than anyone had realized. By early July 1916, Webb and Sheriff Clay decided to pay Ward another visit. But this time, they came prepared. They left Marshall at dawn with 2 deputies, a search warrant, and determination in their eyes. The air was heavy and hot as they ascended the steep, twisting trail toward Ward's ridge. Birds fell silent as they neared the cabin. Silas was outside when they arrived, splitting wood with calm precision. His face showed no surprise when he saw them approach. Webb introduced himself formally and presented the warrant. Silas glanced at it, nodded once, and said only, "You'll find what you're looking for." Inside, the cabin was exactly as before, sparse, neat, almost unnaturally ordered. But Webb's attention was drawn to something new, a locked trapdoor beneath a small rug near the bed. When asked about it, Silas replied that it led to a root cellar where he kept preserved food. He handed Clay a rusted key without hesitation. When the sheriff lifted the hatch, a wave of cold, damp air rose from below. The lantern light barely reached the bottom. A narrow wooden ladder descended into the darkness. Webb went down first. The air smelled of earth and something else, faint but metallic. At the base of the cellar, shelves lined the walls with jars of pickled vegetables, sacks of grain, and tools. Everything seemed in order until Webb noticed the ground beneath one of the shelves looked freshly disturbed. The soil was darker, looser. He knelt and brushed it aside, revealing something buried just a few inches below fabric. Torn, faded, and unmistakably human in shape. Clay ordered the deputies to dig carefully. Within minutes, they unearthed what appeared to be a fragment of a dress, and beneath it, bones. Old, brittle, and incomplete. The cellar grew silent except for the sound of shovels striking earth. When Webb climbed back up, Silas Ward was standing by the doorway, motionless. His expression hadn't changed. "You've found what you were meant to," he murmured. Clay placed him under arrest on the spot. Silas didn't resist. He simply stared at the horizon, his pale eyes unreadable, and said nothing more. By nightfall, word had spread across the county. The isolated man of the ridge, the one everyone had whispered about, was finally in custody. But as investigators returned to search the cabin more thoroughly, what they discovered beneath that mountain would shake Madison County to its core. "Safe enough," he muttered, his tone neither reassuring nor dismissive. "The mountains take what they want. Always have." Webb studied the man's face carefully. There was no flicker of fear or concern, not even curiosity about the missing people. His expression was flat, detached, like someone commenting on the weather. Trying to keep the conversation flowing, Webb asked if Silas ever heard strange noises at night or if travelers ever passed through his land. Silas paused for a moment, his hand still resting on the wet stone. "Sometimes," he said quietly. "Voices carry in the woods. You can never be sure what's human and what isn't." Webb forced a small laugh, pretending to take it as a joke, but inwardly he felt a chill crawl up his spine. The man's calmness was unnatural, too measured, too careful. He asked if he could see the surrounding land, claiming he wanted to get a sense of the terrain for farming. Silas hesitated for a second before nodding. "You can walk the edge of it," he said. "Don't go too far into the woods. Ground's not steady that way." The Webb took that as permission. He walked a few hundred feet past the cabin, pretending to admire the view, but his mind was racing. From where he stood, he could see the faint path leading into the thick forest. The same direction witnesses had seen Silas take at night. The trees loomed dense and dark, the canopy so thick it swallowed the sunlight. When Webb turned back, Silas was watching him. Not suspiciously, not angrily, just watching, with that same unnerving stillness. Webb smiled politely, tipped his hat, and thanked him for the conversation. Silas simply nodded and returned to sharpening his blade. That evening, Webb met with Sheriff Clay in secret at a local inn in Marshall. He recounted every detail of the encounter, every word, every look. "He's hiding something," Webb said firmly. "He's too composed. Either he knows what's been happening, or he's directly responsible for it." Clay agreed, but knew they still lacked undeniable proof. The doctor, Henry Sutton, returned the next morning with his preliminary report. The bones, he confirmed, were human, at least some of them. Several belonged to a young female, others possibly to a male adult. He couldn't determine the exact number of individuals, but it was clear they weren't all animal remains. That revelation changed everything. The sheriff and Webb could no longer wait. They obtained an official warrant to arrest Silas Ward for questioning and to conduct a full excavation of the site behind his property. On the night of July 10, 1916, as the moon rose over the ridges, Sheriff Clay gathered a team of deputies and volunteers. They made their way up the mountain under cover of darkness, determined to catch Silas before he could flee. Or worse, before he could destroy whatever remained hidden in those woods. But when they reached the cabin, the door was open. The fire in the stove was still burning, a pot of stew bubbling gently on top as if dinner had just been prepared. A chair lay overturned near the table, and Silas Ward was nowhere to be found. The sheriff's men spread out immediately, calling his name, scanning the tree line with lanterns. Webb entered the cabin and scanned the interior. It was as neat as ever, except for one strange addition, a small, leather-bound book sitting on the table. It hadn't been there before. On the first page, written in neat, spidery handwriting, were the words, "The mountains remember what men forget." The rest of the pages were filled with symbols, the same ones carved into the trees in the forest clearing. That night marked the beginning of one of the largest manhunts in Madison County's history. But despite weeks of searching, Silas Ward was never seen again. What remained in those woods, and what truth lay buried beneath that cold ridge, would haunt the people of North Carolina for generations to come. He said the mountains had always been perilous places. People vanished, slipped off cliffs, or crossed paths with bears and other predators. It had been happening for as long as anyone could remember. Webb studied Silas's eyes as he spoke. There was nothing there, no fear, no empathy, no trace of humanity. It felt like talking to a slab of stone, trying to keep the conversation alive. Webb brought up the woods behind the property. He mentioned the intriguing trails he'd seen and asked if Silas ever hunted there. The change in Silas's expression was faint but telling. His eyes tightened slightly, and his response came a heartbeat too late. He admitted that he sometimes walked those woods but added that the paths were ancient, likely carved by animals or the native people who once lived there. Webb pushed a little further, mentioning strange carvings he'd noticed on tree trunks. Silas didn't move. The silence that followed pressed heavy in the air. Finally, Silas spoke, his tone shifting, reverent almost. He said there were things in those mountains outsiders could never truly understand. Old traditions, old knowledge, preserved only by those who knew how to find it. A chill crept up Webb's spine. When he asked what Silas meant, the man merely shook his head and said some things weren't meant to be shared with strangers. The conversation was done. Webb thanked him for his time and made his way back down the mountain, his thoughts racing with unease. Meanwhile, Dr. Sutton had completed his study of the bones found in the clearing, and his findings were grim. Of the fragments collected, at least 3 were unmistakably human. One was part of a skull, another a rib, and a third appeared to be a section of forearm. Sutton couldn't determine how many individuals they belonged to, and there was no way to identify them with the limited forensic tools available in 1916. Still, the mere presence of human remains in that remote clearing was enough to confirm that something terrible had occurred. Sheriff Clay convened an urgent meeting with Webb and several local leaders. The situation was precarious. They had bones, bloodstains, cryptic symbols, and a man whose behavior grew more unsettling by the hour. Yet no solid proof tied Silas Ward to the three missing people. No witnesses, no confession, and no bodies that could be named. Even with an arrest, conviction would be nearly impossible. They needed more. Webb proposed a larger, coordinated search of Silas's land and the nearby woods. There could be other clearings, other evidence hidden in the dark. Sheriff Clay agreed and began recruiting volunteers, men willing to brave the wilderness in search of the truth. On July 15th, nearly 30 men assembled in Marshall. They were divided into teams, each tasked with scouring a section of forest surrounding Silas Ward's property. The search was to be slow and exhaustive. Nothing overlooked. Silas was informed. Webb thought it wiser not to hide it. Silas didn't argue or resist. He simply stood there, watching the men disappear into the woods with that blank, unnerving expression he always wore. For 3 days, the teams combed the area. They discovered more trees etched with strange symbols, forming an intricate pattern that stretched across kilometers. 2 more clearings were found, both marked by stone formations similar to the first. In one, more bones. In another, the decayed remains of a backpack, too weathered to trace back to anyone. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Joseph Martin's group had followed a narrow stream down the mountainside into a thicket so dense the sun barely reached the ground. The stream passed through a rock formation that formed a shallow cave. Something about the entrance looked unnatural. Wooden planks, half hidden under branches and leaves. When the men cleared the brush away, they realized it was a door. A crude hand-built door. They hesitated. The air was colder here, unnaturally still. The gentle trickle of the stream now sounded like a warning. But they had come too far to turn back. Joseph pushed the door open. It groaned loudly, echoing through the forest. What they found inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The cave stretched deeper than it seemed from outside. Someone had carved further into the mountain. The low ceiling forced them to crouch as they entered. Oil lamps were embedded into stone niches, proof the place had been visited many times. But it was the floor that froze them in place. Scattered across the dirt were personal items, a woman's headscarf, a belt buckle, torn bits of clothing, fragments of colorless fabric, and bones, countless bones. More than they'd seen anywhere else. Joseph felt sick. He sent one man racing back to summon Sheriff Clay and Webb. The others stayed by the entrance, unwilling to step deeper into that nightmare. Then they heard footsteps. Every man spun around, hands gripping their weapons. But it wasn't Silas Ward. It was a boy, no older than 12 or 13, thin, dirty, and dressed in rags. He stopped a few feet away, his face caught between fear and confusion as he stared at the armed men before him. Joseph stepped forward slowly, careful not to startle the boy, and asked for his name. The boy hesitated, as if struggling to remember how to form words. Finally, he whispered, "Timothy." Joseph gently asked what he was doing so deep in the wilderness, so far from any home. Timothy's eyes flicked toward the cave, then back to the men. He said quietly that he lived there. Joseph froze. Lived there, in the cave? Timothy shook his head. Not exactly inside. He said he stayed in a nearby cabin with the mountain man, with Silas. What followed left every man in stunned silence. In a weak, trembling voice, Timothy explained that he had been brought to this place over a year ago. He could barely recall where he came from, only that he'd been traveling through the mountains with his family when he was separated from them. Then Silas found him. At first, the man promised to help him find his family, but instead took him to his remote property. In the beginning, Silas was kind, feeding him, giving him shelter. But it didn't last. Soon, Silas began speaking of ancient wisdom, of sacred rites, and how the mountains demanded offerings to guard their secrets. Timothy didn't understand what that meant, but he knew it was wrong, deeply wrong. He told them Silas often brought people into the woods, travelers, locals, and none of them ever came back. Timothy never saw what happened, because Silas always sent him away before the screams began. But afterward, Silas would return alone, carrying only scraps of clothing or small belongings that once belonged to those missing souls. Timothy had tried to escape more than once, but the forest was endless and disorienting. Every time, Silas found him and dragged him back. Eventually, the boy stopped trying. He lived in silent terror, doing whatever Silas demanded, staying small, staying invisible, waiting for something, anything, to free him. Now, staring at these strangers, he prayed that moment had finally come. When Sheriff Clay and Webb arrived at the cave with a team of deputies, Timothy repeated his story in full. Webb documented every word, every name, every location. It was damning testimony, enough, perhaps, to finally bring Silas Ward to justice. But before any arrest could be made, they had to secure what lay inside the cave. Dr. Sutton was summoned once more. By the time he arrived, night had fallen. Under the glow of oil lamps, he began the grim work of cataloging what they had found. The bones represented at least 4 different people, maybe more. Some of the personal items were recognizable. The headscarf, for instance, was identified by Mrs. Holt as belonging to her missing daughter Sarah. A belt buckle matched one worn by Daniel Pierce, missing for months. Piece by piece, the truth came together. An irrefutable web of evidence against Silas Ward. As Sutton continued his work, Sheriff Clay organized a posse to move on Silas's cabin. They rode out under the fading light. But when they arrived, the cabin was empty. Silas was gone. His few belongings remained, but there was no sign of him. Clay ordered an immediate search. Dozens of men spread into the woods with torches, calling his name, combing every path and ridge. But Silas Ward had vanished, as if swallowed by the mountain itself. For 2 long days, the hunt continued with no success. Some speculated he had fallen from a cliff, or become trapped in one of the region's many hidden caves. Others believed he knew the terrain too well to meet such an end, that he had escaped long before they arrived. Webb wasn't sure what to believe. A part of him felt certain Silas was still nearby, watching, waiting from some unseen hollow in the mountain. But another part knew better, that a man capable of hiding such horrors for years had likely prepared for this moment all along. Then, on the 3rd day, one of the search teams made a final, chilling discovery. South of Silas's property, along a deep ravine that wound through the forest, they found a body buried beneath branches and leaves. It was Silas Ward, or what was left of him. He lay on his back at the ravine's base, eyes open and fixed on the sky above. There were no visible wounds, no blood, no signs of a fall or struggle. It looked as though he had simply lain down and stopped breathing. Dr. Sutton was called again. After examining the corpse, he estimated Silas had been dead for about 2 days, perhaps a little more. The cause of death was unclear. No strangulation marks, no stab or gunshot wounds. Sutton suggested heart failure or maybe poison, though without the proper tools for an autopsy, he couldn't be certain. Webb surveyed the scene carefully. Something about it was profoundly unsettling. Silas's body lay perfectly straight, arms at his sides, legs aligned. It didn't look accidental. It looked deliberate, ritualistic even. Webb circled the area. No signs of struggle, no tracks but Silas's own. It was as if he had walked there with purpose, to that lonely ravine, to die exactly where the mountain had chosen. Body, partially concealed beneath a thin layer of leaves, caught Webb's attention, but what truly made his heart race was something glinting faintly beside it. He knelt and brushed away the dirt to reveal a small glass vial, its bottom lined with a dark, sticky residue. Holding it carefully, Webb showed it to Dr. Sutton. The doctor examined it closely, sniffed the contents, and his brow furrowed. A sharp, bitter scent lingered in the air. Sutton couldn't be certain without proper equipment, but he suspected the vial had once contained poison, likely derived from one of the many toxic plants native to those mountains. Belladonna, hemlock, or perhaps another equally deadly species. The implication was unsettling. If Silas Ward had taken his own life, it meant he'd known capture was inevitable, and had chosen death over justice. Yet Webb couldn't shake the feeling there was something deeper at play. Maybe those strange rituals, the cryptic symbols, and the talk of ancient mountain spirits had ended in some kind of final offering, a pact Silas believed he had to fulfill. Whatever the truth, Webb knew he'd never uncover it. Silas Ward had carried his darkest secrets into the grave. The body was taken back to Marshall to be prepared for burial. No relatives came forward to claim it. There were no records of family anywhere. Sheriff Clay ordered Silas buried in the county cemetery, in the section reserved for paupers and the unclaimed. There was no ceremony, no mourners, only a shallow grave marked by a simple wooden post. Meanwhile, the painstaking task of cataloguing the evidence from the cave and the clearings continued. Webb spent long days reviewing each fragment, every bone and belonging, reconstructing a grim timeline. It soon became apparent that the three recent disappearances, Sarah Holt, Daniel Pierce, and Emma Caldwell, were not the first. The items found suggested many others had met their fate in those woods over the years Silas had lived there. Timothy, the boy rescued from Silas's captivity, was taken to Sheriff Clay's home for protection while efforts were made to locate his family. The boy was deeply traumatized, plagued by nightmares that left him screaming in the dark. But slowly, over time, he began to recover. He spoke in broken fragments about his time with Silas, describing conversations that grew more disturbing with every detail. Timothy said Silas often ranted about voices in the mountains, ancient spirits whispering in the wind, demanding sacrifices to keep their secrets hidden. He claimed the mountains had chosen him as their servant, bound by a duty older than any settler's memory. It was nearly impossible to tell where delusion ended and truth began. To Webb, it became clear that Silas Ward had likely suffered from severe mental illness, made worse by years of isolation and obsession. Yet madness was no excuse for what he had done. Lives had been destroyed, families shattered, and an entire county held captive by fear. When the story broke, it spread like wildfire. Newspapers across North Carolina carried sensational headlines about the hermit butcher of the Appalachians. Reporters flooded Madison County, eager to glimpse the site of the horrors. Webb granted only a few interviews. He preferred that his report speak for itself. Sheriff Clay, though hailed as a hero, found little comfort in the praise. For the families of the victims, closure remained bittersweet. The Holts buried what few remains were identified as Sarah's. The Pierces laid Daniel to rest. Emma Caldwell's grave held only bone fragments and a small pendant believed to be hers. With the limited forensic tools of 1916, absolute certainty was impossible. Each family was left with a lingering ache of doubt, a haunting, what if, that would never fade. Silas Ward's land was seized by the county, but no one wanted it. The cabin stood for months, empty and rotting, until Sheriff Clay finally ordered it burned to the ground. "Let the mountain bury its own darkness," he said. The clearings were dismantled, the stones scattered, and the strange carved trees were marked with warnings to keep travelers away. As for the cave, it was sealed with massive boulders, a permanent tomb for the evil that had thrived within. By late August 1916, Webb returned to Raleigh, carrying with him the weight of the case. He compiled a 230-page report, detailed, methodical, haunting, that would later become a reference for investigators across the state. In it, he concluded that Silas Ward had likely taken at least 8 lives, perhaps more. The true number would never be known. Madison County, in the months that followed, found a strange peace shadowed by unease. The fear had lifted, but something in the air remained unsettled. Children played again in the meadows, men returned to hunting, yet whispers persisted, that the mountains still held secrets man was never meant to uncover. Old residents recalled other disappearances. A farmer named Ezekiel Porter who vanished in 1911 searching for a lost cow, Ruth Anderson gone in 1912 while gathering herbs, a traveling couple who disappeared after asking for directions in 1913. Could these, too, have been Silas's victims? No one could say for sure, but suspicion never faded. Eventually, Timothy's family was found, a small farmstead in Tennessee, 100 miles away. The reunion was tearful but painful. His parents had spent more than a year searching for him, posting flyers, offering rewards, praying for a miracle. When they finally embraced him, the boy they held was changed. He was thinner, quieter, with a distant stare that no warmth could erase. Before leaving Madison County, Timothy asked to see Webb one last time. The investigator, back in Raleigh by then, returned upon hearing the request. They met in the small Marshall Baptist Church, a place Timothy said made him feel safe. The boy told Webb there was something he had never shared, something he wasn't sure anyone would believe. The night before Joseph Martin's men stumbled upon the cave, Silas Ward behaved more erratically than ever before. Sometime past midnight, he woke young Timothy and told him to follow. The boy, trembling and confused, obeyed without question. Silas led him deep into the forest, through the cold mist, until they reached one of the clearings, the largest one, where the great stones stood in their strange formation. Under the flickering glow of a single oil lamp, Silas began speaking to the darkness. He wasn't talking to Timothy. He was pleading with someone unseen. His voice shook as he begged for forgiveness, saying he had failed, that he couldn't finish what was demanded of him. Timothy, terrified and rooted in place, could see there was no one else in the clearing, yet Silas's fear was unmistakable. His face was ashen, his hands trembling violently. Then he turned to the boy and said something that would stay with him forever. "The mountains always take their toll. I tried to feed the hunger in these lands, but it's never enough. Now that they've found me, someone else will take my place. The hunger never ends." Timothy would repeat those words years later to Marcus Webb, his voice still quivering at the memory, when asked if he believed Silas, if there really was something in those mountains. Webb didn't know how to answer. He was a man of logic, a believer in evidence and reason. But even he couldn't shake the feeling that there were things about the case that defied explanation. He thanked Timothy for his courage and assured him that his account would be preserved among his private files. Watching the boy leave with his family, Webb felt two conflicting emotions: relief that Timothy was finally free, and dread at the haunting implications of what he had heard. Could Silas Ward have been more than just a murderer? Could he have been driven by something unseen, something ancient and malignant hidden in those ridges? Webb couldn't say. All he knew was that reason alone didn't seem enough to explain everything that had transpired. As summer gave way to autumn of 1916, the mountains transformed into a blaze of crimson and gold. Life in Madison County began its slow return to normalcy. Harvests gathered, livestock prepared for winter. Yet, when dusk settled over the woods and unease lingered, people avoided glancing toward the ridge where Silas's cabin had stood. Some claimed to see strange lights flickering through the trees on moonless nights. Others swore they heard rhythmic sounds echoing from the forest depths, eerily similar to those reported during Silas's time. Sheriff Robert Clay, though skeptical, investigated several of these claims himself. He found no evidence of rituals or intruders, yet he could never quite shake the feeling that something in those woods watched him back. To the public, he dismissed the rumors as imagination, the lingering trauma of recent events. Privately, however, he admitted to Webb that certain corners of those mountains carried a presence he couldn't explain. In November of that same year, a hunter named Lucas Brennan went missing for 2 days after tracking a wounded deer into the forest. When he returned, pale and trembling, he told a chilling story. He had wandered into one of the old clearings, one that should have been long abandoned, and found the stones rearranged exactly as they had been before. The ground around them bore fresh markings, as if a ritual had recently been performed. Clay led a small group to investigate. What Brennan described was true. The stones had indeed been placed back in their eerie formation, yet no footprints or signs of recent human activity could be found. Clay ordered the stones carried off and thrown into a deep ravine, hoping to end the superstition once and for all. He posted crude wooden signs warning trespassers to stay away, but questions remained. Who had moved the stones? Did Silas Ward have an accomplice who was never discovered? Or, as some whispered, were there others still out there, keeping his dark beliefs alive? When Webb received news of the incident in a letter from Clay, he offered a rational explanation. Perhaps vandals, thrill-seekers, or journalists trying to stir up sensational headlines. But even he admitted the theory didn't feel complete. The winter of 1916 to 1917 was brutal, mirroring the one before. Snow buried the mountain roads, isolating families once more. Around their fireplaces, people began retelling the story of Silas Ward, reshaping it with each retelling. The murderer became a myth. Some said he wasn't human at all, but an evil spirit that took mortal form. Others claimed he had made a pact with forces beyond comprehension, trading his soul for forbidden power. A few swore that when he was seen in the forest, his eyes glowed red, like those of a predator. When Webb returned to the region the following spring, he heard these new tales spreading like wildfire. It unsettled him. He understood the instinct to turn horror into legend. It was a way for people to process trauma, but he feared the truth would be lost. The real story, grim and human, was horrifying enough. Silas Ward had been a man, delusional, broken, and deeply disturbed, not some ghostly entity. By turning him into a monster, people risked forgetting the true lessons about mental illness, isolation, and unchecked madness. Webb began giving quiet talks at churches and community halls, urging people to focus on facts rather than superstition. But he knew he was fighting a losing battle. Myths are stronger than memory, and the mountains had already begun to weave their own version of the story, one that would outlive them all. By spring of 1917, as the nation entered World War I, attention shifted far from Madison County. Young men left to fight overseas, and the horrors of the trenches soon overshadowed the horrors of one mountain man's madness. Yet for those who remained, the shadows of Silas Ward lingered in every quiet rustle of the woods, a reminder that evil, once awakened, never entirely dies. Sheriff Clay initially encouraged Pierce's efforts, but over time it became clear the man's work had turned from dedication to obsession. What began as an attempt to bring order and safety had become a futile effort to control the uncontrollable, to tame the same wilderness that had claimed his son. Emma Caldwell's family, on the other hand, sought healing through purpose. They established a small memorial fund in her name, dedicated to improving education in the county's remote communities. It was a gesture they believed Emma herself would have cherished. Her legacy transforming tragedy into hope. From this fund, a modest wooden schoolhouse was eventually built and named the Emma Caldwell School. Though simple in structure, it stood as a beacon of renewal for a community still shadowed by sorrow. Webb continued his investigative career in the years that followed, taking on numerous cases across the state. Yet none lingered in his mind like that of Silas Ward. In the quiet hours of sleepless nights, he found his thoughts returning again and again to those dark mountains. He kept in contact with Sheriff Clay through letters, their correspondence spanning many years, discussing life, work, and inevitably the haunting events of 1916. In a letter dated 1920, Clay mentioned something that stirred old unease. A local farmer, whose name Clay withheld, claimed to have discovered a weathered notebook hidden in a hollow tree near the remains of Silas Ward's property. The pages were damp and partially ruined, but enough survived to reveal the chilling fragments of a tormented mind. It was Silas Ward's journal, his own irregular record of the years that led to madness. The entries were scattered and inconsistent, written in an uneven hand. Within them, Silas spoke of voices that roused him at night, voices speaking in strange tongues he somehow understood. He described recurring dreams of endless forests and shadowy figures that always remained just beyond his reach. There were accounts of rituals performed under moonless skies, compelled by forces he could not name or comprehend. One passage in particular described the moment he first encountered what he called the hunger of the mountains. He wrote of climbing to the highest ridge one dark night and feeling something vast and alive beneath the earth, a presence that was neither human nor entirely of his imagination. He believed the land itself was aware, conscious, and judging him. In that instant, he claimed, he knew he had been chosen for a purpose, though what that purpose was, he could never truly say. As the years unfolded through those pages, Silas's descent into paranoia and delusion became unmistakable. He wrote of distrust toward every person he met, of seeing wickedness in every passing face, and of the voices growing louder, demanding that he obey their will. What began as fear gradually became devotion, and in those final entries, the man who might once have been ordinary had become entirely consumed by his madness. Clay offered to send the notebook to Webb, but Webb declined. He replied that he had already seen enough of the darkness that had lived inside Silas Ward, and feared that reading further would drag him into a pit from which he might never climb out. Clay understood. He locked the notebook away in his office safe, intending it to remain there, evidence of a mind broken beyond repair. The years passed quietly in Madison County. Though life went on, the land bore invisible scars from what had transpired. Then, nearly a decade after Ward's death in 1925, a young journalist from Charlotte named Robert Freeman arrived in the mountains. He had heard fragments of the story, whispers of the hermit killer, and believed there was more to uncover, something worth revisiting with clarity and care. Freeman spent 2 weeks in Madison County, interviewing those who had lived through the ordeal. He spoke with Sheriff Clay, now gray-haired but still in office, with Joseph Martin, the hunter who had first discovered the cave, and with William Pierce, still wandering the woods, mapping his grief in careful lines. He even found Timothy, now 22 and living with his family in Tennessee, working as a carpenter, still carrying the quiet shadow of his past. Freeman's article, published in the Charlotte Observer in October 1925, was methodical and compassionate. It retold the events truthfully, but with a broader perspective, examining the isolation of mountain life, the absence of mental health care, and the ways such neglect could allow tragedy to fester unseen. He asked whether Silas Ward might have been saved had he lived in a world with the means to understand his illness rather than fear it. The story reignited public interest, though this time not for the thrill of horror, but for reflection. Webb, who had retired from investigative work in 1923, read Freeman's piece and was deeply moved. He wrote to the young journalist, praising his balanced approach and offering access to his private case files should Freeman ever wish to expand the article into a book. Freeman accepted, and over the next 2 years, he immersed himself in the research, returning to Madison County, photographing the old sites, and gathering testimony from survivors and witnesses. In 1928, his book Shadows in the Appalachians was published by a small Asheville press. It was no national sensation, but it found an audience among readers of history and tragedy, ensuring the tale of Silas Ward would not vanish completely into myth. Yet the book's success carried an unforeseen consequence. Curiosity seekers began flocking to Madison County, tourists searching for the remnants of Silas's cabin, the clearings, even the sealed cave. Sheriff Clay, who had once supported Freeman's work, soon found himself frustrated by the intrusion. Strangers trespassed on private land, treating the sight of unspeakable suffering as a morbid attraction. He eventually posted warnings at every trailhead, declaring the area off limits and urging outsiders to leave the community in peace. Over time, the crowds thinned, though every so often, a curious traveler would still appear, chasing ghosts through the trees. Then, amid this brief resurgence of attention, a new revelation surfaced. An elderly woman named Margaret Sullivan, living in a nursing home in Knoxville, reached out to authorities with a startling claim. She said she had known Silas Ward many years earlier, before the mountains, before the madness, when he lived under a different name in East Tennessee. Back then, she said, he had been known as Samuel Ward, a quiet blacksmith who lived an ordinary life until an accident in 1906 changed everything. After suffering a severe head injury, his behavior began to shift dramatically. He became prone to violent seizures, erratic moods, and haunting visions that no doctor could explain. Episodes of disturbing behavior began to surface. Samuel spoke of strange visions, of voices and commands that, he claimed, came from unseen forces. At first, the townsfolk tried to help, believing he was simply troubled, but his actions grew increasingly erratic and dangerous. One night, several farm animals were found dead, their bodies mutilated in a way that suggested ritual intent. Though nothing was ever proven, suspicion fell heavily on Samuel. He soon became an outcast, shunned, avoided, and ultimately vanished from the community altogether. That disappearance occurred around 1907 or 1908, the same period when a man calling himself Silas Ward first appeared in Madison County. When Sheriff Clay shared these findings, Webb was captivated. At last there was a possible link, a thread connecting the mystery. A severe head injury could explain Silas's transformation. Modern science recognized that trauma to the brain could drastically alter personality and behavior. If Samuel Wardell and Silas Ward were indeed one and the same, then the path from an ordinary man to a monster had finally been traced. Webb lamented not having this knowledge during the original case, though he admitted it likely wouldn't have changed the outcome. Margaret, however, offered further pieces to the puzzle. She recalled that before his accident, Silas or Samuel had served briefly in the army, possibly during the Western campaigns against native tribes. He never spoke much about it, but she remembered his terrible nightmares, screams echoing through the night. Combined with his later head trauma, it was easy to imagine how such a mind could fracture beyond repair. Sheriff Clay tried to confirm Margaret's recollections through military archives, but records from that period were incomplete. There was, however, mention of a Samuel Wardell serving in Arizona in 1896, though without enough detail to be certain. Still, her story remained the most convincing origin yet uncovered. By 1930, the Great Depression hit the North Carolina mountains hard. The struggles of daily survival, finding food, work, and shelter, pushed old horrors into the background. Tales of Silas Ward faded into folklore, whispered warnings from elders about wandering too deep into the woods or trusting strangers who lived alone. Then came World War II. The mountain communities changed forever as young men left to fight in distant lands, many never to return. The people of Madison County began to see themselves as part of something larger than their isolated world. Time itself seemed divided before the war and after, and Silas Ward's name became a relic of that shadowed past. Sheriff Robert Clay passed away in 1943 at the age of 74, leaving behind 3 decades of service and an unshakable legacy. At his funeral, men who had joined him in the grim searches of 1916 spoke of his perseverance, his unwillingness to settle for easy answers. His successor, Frank Morrison, inherited not only the badge but the meticulously kept Ward files, each page a record of the county's darkest chapter. A year later, Marcus Webb died at 71, at his home in Raleigh. Long retired, he still often revisited that case in his thoughts. In his later years, he lectured at universities, using the Ward investigation as a study in rural criminology. His extensive notes and correspondence, hundreds of pages, were donated to the University of North Carolina, where they became invaluable material for students of history and criminal psychology. As for Timothy, the boy who once lived under Silas Ward's roof, he built a new life marked by quiet resilience. He married in 1928, raised 3 children, and became a respected carpenter in Tennessee. Yet those who knew him spoke of the sadness behind his eyes, a distance that never left him. For decades he kept his story locked away, sharing it only with his grandchildren in his final years. When Timothy passed in 1987, at the age of 83, he took with him memories no one else on earth possessed. The mountains themselves changed with time. Roads were paved, electricity reached remote valleys, and the hum of telephones replaced the silence of the ridges. The land where Silas once lived was turned into a state forest preserve in 1956, closed to development but open to hikers. Some who ventured deep enough still found odd remnants, stones arranged in strange patterns, trees bearing distorted carvings nearly swallowed by bark and time. The cave entrance, once sealed, still existed, hidden, overgrown, and almost invisible. Rangers received questions about the old stories, but their responses were always cautious, acknowledging the past while warning against seeking too much. By the close of the 20th century, the Silas Ward case had become a fascination for historians and true crime researchers alike. Books, documentaries, and later podcasts dissected every known detail. Some tried to diagnose Ward with modern psychiatric terms, others explored how isolation and fear could twist a human soul. As with all legends, truth and myth blurred together. For descendants of the victims, however, the fascination brought only renewed pain. They declined interviews, avoiding documentaries and publications. The past, for them, was better left buried. In recent years, there have been proposals to memorialize the victims, plaques, gardens, small monuments, but every attempt has been met with quiet resistance. Many in Madison County believe that disturbing the memory of Silas Ward invites the darkness back. To this day, no official memorial stands. Only the whisper of the forest remains, reclaiming what was once his home, until even the traces of evil fade completely beneath the leaves. ChatGPT said, "The remnants of the cabin where he once lived are long gone, its charred foundation now hidden beneath layers of fallen leaves and time. Young trees rise where a clearing once stood, their roots weaving through what little remains. Nature has reclaimed the land, softening the scars of human darkness. It stands as a quiet reminder that even the most tragic places can heal, at least on the surface." For those who study the case today, Silas Ward represents many things. To some, he is a grim example of how untreated mental illness can spiral into catastrophe. To others, his story is a warning about the dangers of profound isolation. Some see him as evidence of why communities and support systems are vital, to catch those who might otherwise slip through the cracks. And yet, there are those who see only the shadow, a man consumed by something unexplainable, proof that certain darknesses defy all logic. More than a century has passed since the events that shook these mountains, yet the story of Silas Ward endures as one of the most haunting and mysterious in Appalachian criminal history. Madison County has changed beyond recognition. Tourists now come for the scenic trails, the rolling peaks, and the calm beauty of the land, never realizing the horrors once hidden among these forests. But those who know who've sifted through the courthouse records or listened to the elders whose ancestors lived through that nightmare, understand the lessons that still echo through time. Silas Ward's story reminds us of the fragility of the human mind, how trauma and isolation can twist perception into something monstrous. It also reminds us of courage, the steadfast determination of men like Sheriff Clay and Marcus Webb, who faced unspeakable evil with little more than willpower and instinct. The victims, Sarah Holt, Daniel Pierce, Emma Caldwell and others whose names have been lost, deserve to be remembered not as statistics but as people. Sarah, only 17, had her entire life ahead of her. Daniel was a skilled woodsman, resourceful and brave. Emma, a devoted teacher, helped shape young minds. Their absence left wounds that time could never fully close. The question that has haunted investigators ever since remains unresolved: what truly drove Silas Ward? Was it the fractured mind of a man destroyed by injury and madness? Was it faith in twisted rituals he believed gave him power? Or something even darker, an evil no science can define? His surviving writings and the scattered testimonies of those who met him reveal fragments, but never a full picture. We know he hid in those mountains for years, protected by the isolation of the terrain and the culture of silence that discouraged interference. Some believe the true number of his victims reached 15 or 20, spread across nearly a decade, though the truth will forever remain uncertain. The investigation that finally uncovered his crimes was painstaking and relentless. Webb and Clay pursued every lead, catalogued every finding, and refused to surrender even without the modern tools we now take for granted. No DNA analysis, no computers. Just intuition, persistence, and an unwavering sense of duty. Silas Ward's death, likely by his own hand, robbed the world of a confession. There was no trial, no statement, no reckoning before a court. Only a body at the bottom of a ravine and an unsettling silence. For some, that silence made the story even more haunting. For others, it was enough. A grim kind of justice that ensured the darkness ended with him. The Appalachian mountains still hold their secrets. Vast valleys untouched by human presence, dense forests where the sunlight barely reaches, and caverns that no one has fully explored. It's easy to imagine how a century ago, someone like Silas could vanish into that wilderness, unseen for years. But it's equally important to remember that these mountains are also home to strength and kindness, to communities bound by compassion and tradition. Silas Ward's crimes were an aberration, not a reflection of the land or its people. Today, visitors walk the trails of Madison County, surrounded by quiet beauty, unaware of what once transpired there. And perhaps that's as it should be. Life continues. New generations grow up unburdened by that darkness, and the earth itself heals. But some stories should never fade completely. The tale of Silas Ward reminds us why mental health care matters, why vigilance and empathy must coexist, and why isolation can become a breeding ground for despair. It urges us to build communities that watch over one another, not out of suspicion, but out of shared humanity. As the sun dips behind the ridges of North Carolina, long shadows stretch across the valleys, carrying whispers of the past. Every mountain, every stream, every grove holds memories of those who came before, of joy, of loss, of endurance. Among them, the story of Silas Ward endures, a chilling mirror reflecting both the depths of human depravity and the resilience of those who stood against it. Welcome to the end of this journey through one of Appalachia's darkest chapters. If this story moved you, if it made you ponder the limits of the human mind and the strength of ordinary people, then its purpose is fulfilled. These stories are told not to glorify horror, but to honor the victims, respect those who sought truth, and preserve the lessons that time must never erase. If you found this exploration meaningful, consider subscribing for more stories buried deep within the shadows of American history. Share your thoughts in the comments, and tell us which forgotten chapters you'd like to uncover next.